The International Panel on Climate Change, Environment Canada, National Geographic, and many other scientific bodies and publications assert that the average global temperature has risen by 0.6 degrees Celsius since the late 19th century. This assertion is based on a dataset provided by the Climate Research Unit, headed by Phil Jones, a professor in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia. When asked by independent researcher Warwick Hughes for the raw data behind the dataset, Dr. Jones replied, "We have 25 or so years invested in the work. Why should I make the data available to you when your aim is to try and find something wrong with it?" Since then, Steve McIntyre also attempted to get the raw data from the UK Met Office, but his Freedom of Information request was denied, with the UK Met Office citing a secret non-disclosure agreement they had with Dr. Jones, the documentation for which they could no longer find. In Dangerous Deception, a recent article in the Canada Free Press, Dr. Tim Ball, a former climatology professor at the University of Winnipeg, explains why this lack of transparency is so worrying. Recently, the Corbett Report had a chance to talk to Dr. Tim Ball about transparency, intellectual honesty, and the climate change debate.
If you're working in a lab or in a university and you're playing around with ideas and experiments and so on, there's always an academic or scientific responsibility that you have to be able to show your work and explain your work and so on. And in many cases that's not being fulfilled. I mean, the hockey stick where finally it was tested after how they'd done it was disclosed, saying, you know, we can't, this is wrong. But when you go public and say, here's the results and this is the truth, then there's a social responsibility that kicks in. And unfortunately, and in some ways, if the politician does it, that's fine, because the credibility of politicians is so low. And the public understand they're doing it for a political motive. But when you get a scientist going public with it for a political motive, bringing the credibility of science to it, but doing it for their own political agenda, then you have really crossed that line between the scientific responsibility and the social responsibility. And in fact, I'm writing an article right now about a scientist. One of his pieces of information was that the world's warmed by 1 degree Fahrenheit or 0.6 degrees Celsius in the last 130 years. Well, he's refusing to disclose how he came up with that number. And I mean, I personally think that's almost criminal. If you are, what are you hiding? If it's just numbers, what's the problem? And he actually wrote an email to Warwick Hughes, the Australian researcher, said, you know, how did you get this number? And he said, why should I share that with you? It took 25 years of my work, and all you want to do is find fault with it. That's a scary comment coming from a scientist. He's still blocking it, by the way. He's using the UK Met Office to claim that there's confidentiality. Now, the public might say, well, how is this a big deal? I mean, surely there's the raw data, and then you come up, anybody can get the raw data and match his numbers. But what the public need to know is that there are 4 major agencies producing global temperature on an annual basis. They come up with different numbers each year. And the number, I remember one year, it varied by 0.4 degrees Celsius. Well, if you're saying 0.6 in 100 years, and each year you're differing by 0.4, using the same data, well, the reason there's a difference is because you don't use the raw data. You adjust, you modify, manipulate the raw data, and of course, at what point are you doing it to get the result that you want? Well, if you're not willing to disclose how you came up with your number, the suspicion has to be, you cooked the books, fella. And I think if that number of 0.6, which is quoted everywhere, National Geographic have it on, the NOAA, the American National Oceanographic, they've on their website, Environment Canada used the number, and yet here the guy that produced it is not willing to explain how he got it. We got a serious problem on our hands, and of course what's interesting is nobody wants to come out and say you cooked the books. But what other explanation can you come up with for not disclosing that information? I mean, how could it be possibly secret or confidential? The difficulty is, and Tolstoy identified this 100 years ago, you know, that if you've made a career out of selling an idea and to your friends and to your colleagues and to the world, and then you've got to be the one that comes out and says, gee, you know what I told you, completely wrong. That's tough, very tough. And but if we're going to influence entire energy and economic programs for the world, because cap and trade, Kyoto, all of these things are based on these numbers, there is a massive, massive social responsibility. And unfortunately, there have been enough of these people that have not been willing to accept that and have crossed the line. So it isn't just that the politicians have politicized science, it's those scientists that have politicized science that are the problem.